So I have a property, a big property.
US President Donald Trump has told Taoiseach Micheál Martin that he does not want to do anything to hurt Ireland, but said there was a massive trade imbalance between the two countries. Speaking in the Oval Office, Mr Martin said it was a two-way street in terms of investment between Ireland and the United States. He also commended the President on the ceasefire plan for Ukraine.
Taoiseach Micheál Martin arrived at the White House and was greeted by President Trump for a meeting in the Oval Office, where the President didn't hold back when it came to US pharmaceutical companies operating in Ireland.
The pharmaceutical companies started to go to Ireland. I would have said, that's okay if you want to go to Ireland. I think it's great. But if you want to sell anything into the United States, I'm going to put a 200% tariff on you. So you're never going to be able to sell anything into the United States. You know what they would have done? They would have stayed here.
The President has strong views on Gaza as well.
Israel has been under siege, as you can see, and they had to fight back. October 7th was a terrible thing. People don't like to mention it, but it was a terrible, terrible day in the life of the world.
But the Taoiseach emphasised the things they agree on.
We shared the President's, again, unrelenting focus on peace. And he's envoying the President himself, as soon as he came into office, went to get a ceasefire. We've been calling for a ceasefire for a long time. We do desperately need hostages out, all of them. It's been far too long. Let me finish, please. And then we need a ceasefire. We need to consolidate that. We need a surge of humanitarian aid into Gaza.
And it was a similar message on Ukraine.
When the first tentative steps to get peace in Ireland, people criticised people like John Hume or people like Albert Reynolds, the then Taoiseach. But they kept going. And when we got that ceasefire in 1993, okay, it took a number of years to get the comprehensive peace settlement. But again, the guns more or less largely went silent. The war in Ukraine is a devastating war on young people. And I think that very simple, straightforward narrative is to be commended.
And he pushed back gently but firmly on the idea that Ireland contributes nothing to the US economy.
We are investing a lot more in America now, and people may not realise, but Ryanair, one of our biggest airlines, for example, AirCap, they buy more, the two of them together buy more Boeing airplanes than anybody else outside of America. Good. It's a very good relationship we have. It's a historic one. It's happened over time. We've added value to American companies. We've increased their value. They've got access to the European market, and they did all of that. I understand where you're coming from fully. But I think it's a relationship that we can develop and that will endure into the future, and will change, it will adapt, and you're evolving and you're doing things.
And they've done a very good job. Now, I just will say this, but with all that we've said, we could talk about Ryanair. There's a massive deficit.
Yeah.
I don't mean by a little bit. I mean, there's a massive deficit that we have with Ireland and with other countries too. And we want to sort of even that out as nicely as we can.
So, no fireworks in the Oval Office. Indeed, plenty of praise for Ireland from the President.
Well, we're joined now by Sean Whelan, who's at the US Capitol, and we're also joined by our political correspondent, Paul Cunningham, who's at Leinster House. Sean, to you first, what was the feeling in the room during that meeting?
I thought the feeling was pretty good, to be honest. You never know what way the President is going to bounce on any given morning. Today, he seemed to me like he was in rather a good mood, and he was quite loquacious. He spoke for almost an hour. Well, the meeting between the two of them that was open to us media went on for almost an hour, and the President had a lot to say, and the Taoiseach, I think, wisely let him say it and really didn't get involved too much. The only areas where he did intervene tactically, I guess, and strategically was on the issues of Gaza and Ukraine. And in many ways he echoed the language of the President, finding the common ground with the President. It's a war that's killing people. We've got to stop the killing of people, particularly children. Saying the type of things that Donald Trump says himself, and using his own words back to him, and also saying, as you heard in that clip, our own experience with Northern Ireland meant that people who took initiatives for peace early on were often criticised, but in the end of the day, the point was to stop the fighting. So those were the good parts of it. perhaps less good parts of it were when it came to the trade policy. You heard the president there, very, very strong criticisms, which he's had for a long time, about US pharmaceutical companies. Now, what he said there did not mean that he is imposing a 200% tariff on pharmaceuticals coming from Ireland. Not at all. He was blaming previous presidents for allowing, as he put it, American companies to relocate to Ireland. He said, I don't blame Ireland for doing what they did. They took advantage of the situation as they found it, and they've done really well out of it. In fact, he had a lot of very, very positive things to say about Ireland, particularly about his own golf course down at Doonbeg and the hotel development there. He had a lot of pretty negative things to say about the European Union, both around that golf course, but more particularly around trade policy, tax policy, the suing of US companies. He was particularly critical of the case against Apple and the $15-16 billion fine that was levied on them. So you can see clearly that he's coming after the European Union. He's preparing to do a trade and tariff fight with the European Union. He understands it's an EU competence trade policy, that there's no point really beating up the Irish about trade because that deal will ultimately be done with the European Union, the very people who have levied retaliatory tariffs against the US this very day. So the EU are the target, not so much Ireland, and Ireland seems so far to have slid through this meeting with the President.
All right, Paul, so there was a fairly good feeling in the room overall, according to Sean. But what will the feeling be back here at home? Will the government be happy with how that went, and what will the opposition say?
From the government's perspective, I think the first thing will be a case of relief that this didn't turn into some diplomatic disaster. One has to remember that it was only this morning the EU was talking about reciprocal tariffs. Could it be, they must have wondered, could this be the opportunity for President Trump to really get stuck into the European Union and the first EU leader sitting in front of him? Instead, there was that cordial relationship, which is Sean has outlined. So I think that's the first thing. This went as well. They will note that the Taoiseach got across the speaking points, particularly in relation to this two-way street in economy, more than 700 companies employing 200,000 EU citizens, and just trying to push back against that narrative to a broader US audience that it's all one-way traffic as well. He was always going to be diplomatic on the issue of Ukraine and Gaza. He would make his point, but it was never going to be pointed. And so the other reactions coming through just initially is that of the opposition, and they're picking up on that sort of diplomatic move, the diplomatic strategy which was clearly employed by the Taoiseach. Sinn Féin saying this evening that the Taoiseach was unnecessarily deferential in how he addressed the issue of Gaza, that he should have been more forceful, and that was something he sort of let himself down on. The Sinn Féin housing spokesperson Owen Bryn saying that when it came to housing that was raised during that hour-long media briefing, that it became something of a joke, and Owen Bryn saying that shouldn't have happened. Stronger language coming from people before profit, as you'd expect. Utterly pathetic plamosing of Donald Trump by Micheál Martin. That's according to Richard Boyd Barrett. I'm sure the government will say he would say that, wouldn't he? But all in all, not a diplomatic disaster, instead a cordial relationship. They got across their speaking points. So I think ultimately, as one analyst said, this was a mission to get out of Dodge. That's what Micheál Martin did.
Political correspondent Paul Cunningham from Leinster House and Sean Whelan from Washington. Thank you both.